Tonight's event is being brought to you by City Lights in conjunction with Alfred Knopf, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and our friends and neighbors over at Zoetrope All Story. We are delighted and honored to have with us tonight David Thomson. We are celebrating the launch of his new book, A Light in the Dark, A History of Movie Directors. It is published by Alfred Knopf. In a review today in his On Directing column, director Peter Bogdanovich gives A Light in the Dark a very glowing review, describing it as, quote, a work that takes us through virtually all the widely varying qualities that directors have possessed or should possess, unquote. He goes on to describe Mr. Thompson's writing as, quote, hip, eloquent, and extremely perceptive, and considers him, quote, the very best film critic historian currently writing. I would say here at City Lights, we would wholeheartedly agree with all of that. A Light in the Dark is a wonderful document. I mean, whether you're an up-and-coming filmmaker yourself or just somebody who really enjoys film, it has so much to offer. Mr. Thomson is a celebrated film critic and author of more than 25 books, including the Biographical Dictionary of Film, Sleeping with Strangers, How the Movie Shaped Desire, biographies of Orson Welles and David L. Selznick, and the pioneering novel Suspects, which was peopled with characters from the film. Mr. Thomson is originally from London and educated at Dulwich College and the London School of Film Technique. He worked in publishing for many years at Penguin. He directed the film studies program at Dartmouth College. He produced the series Life at 24 frames per second for BBC Radio. He scripted the film The Making of a Legend, Gone with the Wind, and has served on the selection committee for the New York Film Festival. So joining him tonight in conversation will be Jonathan Kiefer, formerly the editorial director of Candor. Mr. Kiefer is a member of the SF Films Filmmaker Residency Program and SF Film Critics Circle. Most recently, he's the screenwriter of the independent film drama Around the Sun, released last year in Northern America and the UK. He has served as a reader for Zoetrope All Story. Before we begin, I'd like to let everyone know we're going to be posting links in the chat function with which you may purchase books. The chat is activated via the panel at the bottom of your Zoom dashboard. We will also be having a Q&A at the end of the discussion, so please do post your questions and comments in that same chat function. So to say a few words at the outset, I'd like to welcome now Michael Ray, the executive editor at Zoetrope All Story, our co-host for the evening, and dear neighbor. Welcome, dear Michael.
Thank you so much, Peter. And yeah, as Peter mentioned, City Lights and Zoetrope are neighbors in North Beach. And pre-COVID, we'd collaborate on a lot of events and projects. And my favorite aspect, I think, of working in the city was that we'd happen into one another frequently on Columbus Avenue. And now, you know, we end up collaborating and meeting in this sort of digital space. But I am grateful to meet anywhere with Peter and all the folks at City Lights are such dear friends, and to be here with David, whose work I've admired ardently for decades, with John, who's a dear friend going back 20 years now, is a really supremely welcome solve to the isolation. And so thanks to all of the contributors tonight, to all of you in attendance for joining this conversation. I know it's going to be a treat. And with that, I'll turn it over to David and John.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you to City Lights and to Zoetrope, of course. And hello, David. Nice to see you.
Hi, good to be here.
Thank you for another treat of a book. They keep coming. I just wanted to point out, I've got the book with me, of course, and this is the also by David Thomson page with so many titles that actually there's not enough room for all of them. There are more books than can fit on the also by David Thomson page, and that's an impressive achievement. Several of those books are actually on the shelf behind me.
Oh, good.
Throughout
Good.
my house. Now, I think I just wanted to talk a little bit about your, to sort of situate this in context a little bit. I think you're probably best known as the author of the Biographical Dictionary of Film, which has been published in many iterations. And I think what's so fascinating about this book, and with regard to that one, is that, and as is true of many of your books, it's sort of the experience of reading you over time is sort of like, you know, when you have a photo from the Hubble telescope on your computer and you sort of zoom in, and then it's like galaxies give way to more galaxies. You know, there's just this sense of so many layers of thoughtfulness about film history and about the personalities that are involved in making what we call cinema, which continues to evolve even as a relatively young art form. I wanted to ask you if I'm inferring rightly from the acknowledgments in your book that this one didn't necessarily originate with you, that it was it required some persuasion for you to write this book. Is that true? And can you tell us more about that and sort of just about how the book came to be?
Well, it grew out of an old friendship, although I haven't seen the friend for a long time because he's an English publisher. But we continue to communicate about soccer more than anything else because we are both major soccer fans. And he said to me, what about a book about directors? And I didn't take to the idea at first, but I began to get interested in a process that maybe is worth talking about. Over the last, let's say, 15 years, like you, I'm sure, and like many people, I've spent a lot of time watching and enjoying long-form television series. Mm-hmm. And there's plenty of bad stuff in long-form TV streaming, but, you know, every now and then you get a show like The Sopranos, like Breaking Bad, like Babylon Berlin, like Ozark. You can pick your favorites. We don't all agree on them, but I began to see or feel for myself that some of these series, when they were good, were as good as, or if not better, than the movies being offered theatrically. And for instance, I don't think anything in America has been made in the last 20 years to match Breaking Bad. And I said to myself, as an old-fashioned auteurist who believed that directors made films, I said, who's directing Breaking Bad? And I couldn't answer my own question. And I think that many people who watch these episodes, binge over them, they go through the credits without looking. They take a break then. And we literally don't know who made them. And that is anathema to the spirit that I was raised in say the 60s and 70s particularly, which was to identify films in terms of the people who had made them, and really to begin to see those people as auteurs and artists about whom we could write books and teach classes. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't got into academia to write books, to teach about people like Renoir and Welles, people like that. It was a structure for a way of looking at films. And I think it was a totally justified structure, because I do think still to this day that a lot of great films are made by very talented individuals who insist, they assert themselves on everyone else on the film, and they say, this is my film. I'm going to make this film. I'm going to be the Godfather on this film, even if it isn't called The Godfather. And it's a very legitimate way of studying film. But we should remember that for decades before the auteur theory came into being, the public didn't know who directors were. They maybe knew a few people like Hitchcock and Chaplin and Cecil B. DeMille, but they didn't know what directors did. And they didn't know that 3 or 4 films they liked might have been made by Howard Hawks, because they just weren't taking directors seriously. And that's what we're back to now when you look at Ozark, let's say, and you don't really know who directed a single episode, because Ozark is coming out of a collaborative structure in which I think writers are much more important than they ever were before, and where you're really identifying in terms of the actors. And it just made me feel that the position of the director is changing, and nothing you can do about it. I mean, you may be nostalgic for the age of auteurs, but something is happening that is reflecting the way we're using film in general. It's part of the fact that children are making films. They don't know they're directing them. They're just putting shots together and asking someone to do a silly act or something like that. That's very like the way films began. And I think we're sort of going back to a time when the cameraman was very important, the actors were very important, the people who paid for it were very important, but directors were almost incidental. D.W. Griffith really only became a director because he wasn't a very good actor and he was not much respected as a writer, but he wanted to stick around and work in it. So he said, well, what can I do? And they said, well, you could direct if you like. And directing was really a managerial task then. Now, Griffith seized upon the opportunity and had a great talent. We have to admit, whatever we think about him today, a great talent to make a narrative language for films. He wasn't the only one who did it, but he was a very important figure in that. So I began to get very interested in the potential for this book, in seeing that directing had taken an arc, and it's evolving, and it will continue to evolve, to evolve long after I'm here to observe the films. And we should pay attention to it because it has a lot to do with the nature of film. It is still true to this day that the majority of people all over the world think movies are about the actors. And it is the acting personality that draws people. And if you and I were to talk to people on the street about mise en scène, they would think we'd gone a little crazy. And, you know, maybe we did.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, the somebody has mentioned in the comments, you know, the idea of a showrunner as the sort of auteur of television. And I think, you know, I would say for fans of Breaking Bad, be sure to see Better Call Saul because it's the same people involved. I think it's a great show as well.
Absolutely.
But I think that most people, fans included, you know, the idea of a showrunner is still a semi-vague concept.
Absolutely.
Whereas the idea of, oh, Saul Goodman, the character played by Bob Odenkirk, who is in Breaking Bad, has a new show about him and is a prequel. You know, I think people sort of pick up on that idea, and that people get drawn to that world for that reason. You know, it's interesting that you know, looking at the book, I mean, I should confess that I haven't gone back and sort of looked at everything you've ever written about all these directors that are sort of highlighted in the book. And if my calculations are correct, it seems like you've been able to write at length and with depth about people like Orson Welles for probably a quarter of a century at this point. How do you find fresh insights about these figures that you've been thinking about for a long time? Because I mean, the book really does feel fresh, and especially in the Welles chapter, I think there's so much.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I keep watching old movies.
Right.
And I've discovered that they change. Now, they don't change. Frame by frame, they're the same. But I change. The climate and the culture change. And, you know, I think that one of the most interesting things about the history of American film is that if you look back at the whole span of it, you could say, arguably, we had two monumental films that really did a great deal to make the business in a moneyed sense: Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. Now, one of them we really can't see anymore. I mean, to show Birth of a Nation publicly, I think is out of the question. And I think Gone with the Wind is getting into that area. It's going to become disreputable. And it's only going to be shown with apologies and explanations and that kind of thing. The passion of it, the feeling that people had for decades of falling in love with Scarlett O'Hara, that's going to be shelved in a funny way. Now, I can say that about films that old and it's acceptable. But let me make this suggestion. I think a time will come, and I apologize to Zoetrope in saying this, a time will come when the culture will look at The Godfather and say, you know, that is a completely fascistic absorption in organized crime and male supremacy, in which women are constantly shut out of the room or exploited. How did we swallow it for so long? Partly because it's a great film, brilliantly made. But I do think that a lot of its attitudes are not going to be bearable in, say, 10 years' time, maybe less than 10 years. That happens with all films. They date. If you look at Casablanca today, it's easy to see how well made it is. But if you ask yourself the question, do you think Casablanca understands the war it was about? It's a travesty of that. And I'm very interested in looking at the films I loved as a kid and asking myself, do I still love them in the same way? And so for me, this book was a way of revising a lot of things I had thought. One of the great problems about the Biographical Dictionary for me is that if I were to do a new edition of it, I would almost need to rewrite the whole book, because my feelings have shifted on nearly everything, you know? And I don't know how to watch a film without undertaking that kind of openness to change. So that I know some people say, well, My Man Godfrey, the first time I saw it in 1937, was a great film. And now I'm 92 and I'm watching it, and it's still the same film, a great film. I find it very hard to buy into that. I like the way the film and I have a changing relationship.
That's, yeah. And I think that you allow us into that, you give us a window into your mind in the book, in all the books, really. And that it's a pleasure to spend time thinking about them. I mean, I feel that way too. It's funny that you mentioned My Man Godfrey. I mean, I haven't seen that film since I was in college, and I remember liking it at the time. But I'm sure if I revisited it now, it would be a culture shock of some kind, and that's true of anything.
I think you'd still love it, but you'd find you have to look at it in a slightly different way.
Yeah. To back up a little bit, I think it's interesting, something, to thinking about the idea of cinema versus long form television, for example. I thought it was interesting, as you're looking through the table of contents in this book and you think, okay, this is a book about directors. And so here are some familiar names. You see Orson Welles, you see Fritz Lang, you see Hitchcock, Godard. And then to my surprise, a pleasant surprise, you see Stephen Frears, which is an interesting figure. And part of what I associate with Stephen Frears is a certain fluidity between the big screen and the small screen. And I think that might be why maybe people don't know his name, but also I think why his career has sort of sustained the way that it did. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about your experience of his work.
Well, I feel I've grown up with him. He and I are almost the same age. And what I like about him as a person and as a filmmaker is that he's very modest, he's very self-effacing, and he says, it's my job to make films, and I depend on a script and a good cast, and if those things come together reasonably well, then I have a chance of making a film that will be decent. He believes, I think, in professionalism as his métier. I don't think he would ever be comfortable excuse me, saying, I just made a Stephen Frears film, because I think it is his sense of himself that he would never admit to that being, that Stephen Frears in public. In private, I suspect he has that ego, but he's been raised in a culture and in a business, and as you say, he began in TV, where it really was not decent or proper for a director to assert himself in that way. English directors have never really liked to say, it's me, I did it. One of the things that happened with Hitchcock going from England to America was that I think he felt more able to say, this is my work. And Frears is a career professional. He works all the time. Another asset that I like a lot in a director. And the work is variable. Why should it not be variable? But he loves the work, and I think you feel that. And as he would say, when he has the script and he has the actors and enough money to do it, something remarkable can happen. But if you were to look at everything he's ever made, just as if you were to look at everything Michael Curtiz ever made, or even William Wyler, you don't really know who Curtiz was, who Wyler was, or who Frears was. Whereas you do know, I think you have a sense of who Hitchcock was, who Wells was, Hawks was, that kind of thing. And I wanted to write at some length about that kind of professional director. And he seemed to be a very deserving case. He is amazingly neglected. You know, even in England, where he's enormously admired and esteemed and is a sort of establishment figure, people don't write about him. There isn't a book about Stephen Frears. If he were American, there would be 2 or 3 books about him. So he represents that way of looking at the movies as a whole.
I'm curious about the book. I mean, if you were to look at the table of contents, you would notice that, and not be surprised, I think, that the names that you see tend to be male names. You do acknowledge that. You know, you acknowledge, I think, that the sort of the male gaze is kind of the origin, legend, and the orthodoxy of cinema, and that's a problem. And I wonder what you think about what a reformation of that would require and what it would yield for the next century of motion picture art. It sounds like, well, I'll let you answer that and we can take it from there.
Well, I'll try to answer. I think it's probably the biggest question in the movies at the moment. For me, as a kid, I grew up on Howard Hawks films, and I love his work. I know it very well. And for the last 20 years, looking at his films, I have been more and more aware that he is a male supremacist. He gives great roles to women. He gives them great opportunities, and he was a discoverer of a lot of actresses we treasure. But there is an attitude in his films that really expects women to behave. And that is characteristic of American movies of the Golden Age. They had a very set sense of sexual attitudes. And for decades, audiences loved it. And I'm old enough, and I'm unashamed about saying I loved it. And I still love Hawks's films, but I think they're very shaky. I think there's a lot of problems. And I know that if theatrical movies are going to continue, and if it's going to be still a mass art, then somehow, for the sake of our sanity and for the sake of decency in our society, this has to change. Now, there's a lot of ways it can change. It can change if more women get to direct and write and photograph films, but it depends on the audience too. And when you put it in that term, then you're really saying America needs to grow up emotionally. And that is a small part of the enormous social, psychological problems the country faces. And I am not sure that the movies can continue as the kind of popular entertainment, the mass entertainment they were for 60 years, let's say. I don't know whether we know how to make a new kind of film that everybody can react to and treat decently. I think maybe we will have two kinds of films. We will have what I will call Marvel films, but that's a broad genre, and independent films. I think that that middle ground, which I loved, and which is really where Hawks, Hitchcock, so many directors found themselves. I'm not sure that can continue to exist. I don't know. I think it's a very vexed issue. And I owe a lot to my wife, who helped me see this in films. And, you know, I think I was a pretty obnoxious male supremacist when she first took me in hand.
To continue with the question about America growing up, which is a difficult question, of course. But I'm just looking at a quote here that I noticed you describe. There's a lot of really pithy description of the context for many of these filmmakers, which I really appreciate. It's great that the book is a book length piece, but also I think people should not underestimate your capacity for zingers and for very pithy, succinct analysis that might even work in the scale of Twitter, for example. But you describe Fritz Lang as, quote, crucial to an understanding of how Weimar collapsed into fascism. And I'm afraid that I want to ask you which filmmakers, if any, you might characterize as crucial to understanding how America collapsed into Trumpism, and why, if there are any filmmakers that would seem helpful for that understanding.
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, I've already identified worries I have over The Godfather. I think a lot of directors of the Coppola generation had an excitement for making a film that sometimes blinds them to what films are about. I think, for instance, and I talk about this in the book, I think that Scorsese has not often managed to get himself out of making films that exult in male gangs. And I think it's a serious limitation to him as an artist. And he is clearly, and has been for decades, one of the most talented people around. I think it's there in Tarantino in the same sort of way. And I don't wish to sort of put a black mark on these people, because I have no right to do that and I have no authority to do it. But I'm just saying, let's look at these films and think about them seriously, because they have a lot to do with where our culture is. Donald Trump's favorite film is Citizen Kane. And, you know, it's no good being appalled by that and horrified by that and saying that Trump is a disaster in every sense, even as a film critic. Think about it more carefully and say, what is it in Kane that Trump loves? And then it's easier to see that it's a film about megalomania. And, you know, it's easy to say, well, Citizen Kane is a bad man. I don't think Wells feels he is a bad man. And then you're getting into a kind of fantasy identification with a film character that affects all of us. We've always identified with these people up on the screen in strange and disturbing ways. So even Wells, who I think is a great, great director, I think you have to look at him very carefully.
Mm. James in the comment section has said it's a film about childhood pain, and Trump has a lot of it, which is an interesting insight.
It's a very interesting insight. Yeah.
I'm also thinking about how, I mean, obviously the nature of the industry has changed in terms of the delivery system of film. I mean, that's obvious to everyone now. We've touched on that a little bit. There's a great line in here that I wanted to quote again, if I may. I think it's from when you're talking about Stroheim and Greed, which is one of the great San Francisco films. I would encourage people to see if they can. The industry was teaching America to assess imagination as a commodity, just as every news report on your smartphone is preceded and humiliated by some advertisement. I really think that the humiliated in that sentence is important, because there is something about the strange collage that we have now of information, and the way image and story are we're bombarded with all this stuff, and the way that we process that, it just seems so different from what I consider to be a somewhat a special experience where you go into a movie theater and sit in the dark. I don't know what the question is, but I just wondered if you could comment a little bit more about that, about what it's like now in the world that we're in with the technology that we have.
Well, I was born and raised in Britain. I didn't come to this country really until I was about 35. So I was raised on BBC television, which did not have advertising, and really still doesn't have advertising. And when I came here, one of the many things that shocked me about the country, much as I enjoy being here, was the extent of advertising, the way it had permeated so many areas in culture. It has in Britain now too. But in my opinion, and this may sound naive and impossible, one of the things we have to do to remake our culture and our society is to reappraise the place of advertising and get rid of it in as many places as we can. I think it's a little bit of a myth that our economy can't function without advertising. I'm not sure that's true. I think that the damage it does, for instance, in the way anything on your phone or any newscast you're watching is bookended by advertising, the way that teaches us not to take things seriously. And that sounds very over earnest, but that's a terrible, terrible thing. And I think that the impact of advertising on children is horrible. And I think it's something we should deal with as best we can. Television in this country is of a profound importance. I think it's more important than the movies ever were. And it needs more thought put into it.
Yeah, it's one gets the impression sometimes from social media that the skill that is prized is the ability for people to become advertisements for themselves.
Totally.
And that's it's easy to be awed by that, but it's also, I find it kind of disturbing as well.
We're in love with manipulation. I mean, you have young children.
Yeah.
You told me earlier. Yeah. And you watch them watching, I'm sure, because that's what you're interested in. And to watch children watching is a quite disturbing thing.
Quite, it is. And to hear them, to hear what they absorb, because later on, playing make-believe, you hear snatches of dialogue from things that you might recognize or not. And we all do that, of course. Anyone who loves movies kind of grew up quoting them.
Yeah. But sooner or later, your child will make you an offer you can't refuse.
Right. Yeah. Beware of that.
Yeah.
I'm curious about. I mean, I should ask you maybe a general question about more about the selection process for the filmmakers who are described in the book. You do sort of go through history, and it's interesting the way you kind of take us through the way the evolution of the medium. I really appreciate the chapter on Godard, especially because I think that his work and his attitude towards cinema is sort of endlessly fascinating. Are there I don't know, omissions, people that you regret or that you still struggle with?
Yeah, I mean, there should be a documentary filmmaker in there. I feel bad that Bergman is not in there. I was afraid of trying to write about Bergman at the rather restrained length that the book allowed. But I could have done the book 2 or 3 times over and still been writing about people I love and in whose importance I believe. So there are many omissions, and I apologize for that. I tried to pick people who I thought historically had been of enormous importance. And I was encouraged by the publisher I referred to earlier to include people that he thought the readers would have heard of.
Right, of course, yeah. I wonder if there are new directors that have startled you or surprised you, that with whom you've taken up a special interest. You mentioned Anna Lily Amirpour, who
well, I mean, for instance, I'm shocked that Kitty Green's The Assistant is not more widely known and admired, because I think it's an extraordinary film. I think that, to make a generalization, I think young women today are probably making more interesting films than young men in this culture. I think Paul Thomas Anderson is a really outstanding director. I would have liked to have written about him at more length, but some other day maybe. I mean, for instance, someone I did not think of writing about in this book beyond a couple of paragraphs, but I really would like to write about him at more length now, would be Woody Allen. Now, Woody Allen has become a pariah, and I won't judge that. I'm not shocked that film directors are not entirely pleasant people. I've met too many of them to live with that idea. But I think that the interest in Allen's work in secrecy and guilt and furtiveness suddenly comes into play more. It's as if what has happened in his life has sort of identified what his films were about all along. I'd like to write about that, but that's
fascinating. I would also point out to our audience, you make me think of your book, The Moment of Psycho, which tells us a lot about the movie Psycho and sort of what it meant to the culture in which it emerged at that time. And it's a fascinating sort of specific yet deep dive into that moment in history. And I mean, I think there's a lot of things like that many of us would welcome your insights. And even if that might be sort of a dangerous topic to some, or certainly controversial. I just want to mention, Nicholas mentioned in the comments here, theories around gays can lead to oversimplifications. Bergman made some of the great films from female perspectives, while Catherine Bigelow makes some from some great macho films, in quotes. And you do address, I think, that in the book. Well, both of those points, which are good points.
Also, I would add this: if at the time he was a genius on the art house circuit, Ingmar Bergman, if the public had known about his private life, he would have been as much an outcast as Woody Allen is today. So timing is very important in those things.
And that, I think, also reminds us that things will be different going forward, as we discussed earlier. Let's see, what else do I had written some things down. There's an interesting comment about Spielberg and Lucas. Also, Lucas in particular, of course, of interest to people in the Bay Area. You describe the two of them collectively as guys who seem to shut down on the art they kept talking about, and that's an interesting insight as well. Tell us more about what you mean by that, and sort of where we stand. I'm so glad that you pointed out that Schindler's List and Jurassic Park happened at the same time and actually have things in common that I think people have trouble processing. But tell us more about the sort of Spielberg-Lucas empire and what it looks like today and what it means.
Well, I mean, Spielberg is a very talented filmmaker. Lucas is a very talented businessman.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to put either talent down, but they were absolutely characteristic of a generation in which young men came into power in Hollywood as it crumbled and said, I'm going to do what I want to do. And they both of them really said, I want to get away from the old Hollywood model. I want to make independent films. Lucas particularly. It's really why he came up to Northern California and why the whole Northern Californian film industry came into being. And I think with a lot of good work along the way, they turned into what they said they were fleeing from. They turned into industrial tycoons.
Mm-hmm.
And, eventually Lucas takes his operation and he sells it back into the business. And Spielberg has not done that, although Spielberg was a big part of a very effective studio. And I admire the hell out of both of them. I think that Spielberg is probably, for me, a more interesting director. Well, he's certainly a more interesting director, but I do think that what has happened to them shows the difficulty of making a career in films and being a huge success.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a difference between making a lot of money and making a film as great as Empire of the Sun. Now, Empire of the Sun, on the face of it, I wouldn't identify as a Spielberg film. I think it has a lot more to do with J.G. Ballard and with that extraordinary kid, Christian Bale. I think it's the only great film Spielberg has made. And I love it deeply. And, I admire both of them, but I'm trying to say, let's look at what they did as a whole, and let's try to see how they didn't sell out the idea of independent film, but it changed as they became more successful.
That's interesting to consider that. I'm looking at a comment here in our comments from Christian who writes, I'm paging through the 5th edition of the Biographical Dictionary of Film and am hung up on your conclusion on Brian De Palma, his then late work From Snake Eyes to The Black Dahlia, which you say, quote, has to be included with his worst work, end quote. Do you cover De Palma in your new book? More important for those of us who have read your earlier writing, would we be surprised to see any revision, upward or downward, on directors you've previously assessed?
Well, I think perhaps they would. I mean, I say in this book something that is very contrary to what his great admirers think. I think that Fritz Lang in America became a mediocre director. I think that Renoir was not the sweetest man, such as we used to tell ourselves he was. I've voiced already my own worries over Hawks. So yes, I mean, I think that if you were afflicted with the need to compare this book with what I've written in the past, you would see there are quite a lot of changes. I have not changed or Brad De Palma, however.
Okay, good to know. Yeah. Are there other projects that people, your friends in publishing, are trying to talk you into to writing, or things that you're trying to talk yourself into writing? Or
well, I'm doing a book that's sort of a sequel to this, which is really a book about what actors have meant to films, and rather than make it an historical survey, a lot of it's going to be concentrated on acting today. I think we have never had a time when acting on screen is as extraordinary as it is today. And I want to talk about that. And it's a subject that excites me a lot, because there is a kid in me still that goes to see films because of the people who are in it.
Yeah.
When I was a kid in South London going to the movies, I didn't really know what the movie was, let alone who directed it. But I saw a picture outside the theater, a poster of Virginia Mayo. And at a very precocious age, I thought, I want that. I want to see Virginia Mayo or Burt Lancaster. So a film like The Flame and the Arrow, in which they co-star, 1950-ish, I think, is still one of my favorite films. And people say, oh, you mean it's your guilty pleasure? I have no guilt about it whatsoever.
Right.
It's a pleasure still.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about what actors mean to us.
That seems to be a topic of an inexhaustible topic. I
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's someone in the comments section here who refers back to the Biographical Dictionary and says, I'm endlessly fascinated by your descriptions of The Godfather Part Two and how insightful your description of the Michael Corleone character is in that movie. Just an observation. And I think your writing on all the Coppola films is fascinating. And as we've discussed a little bit about it here, there's some interesting stuff in this book too. I would encourage people to read, where you take a moment to sort of imagine what it would be like if the first film in the Godfather series ended differently, and Kay kind of had the last word, or that it was more in her favor.
Could you really do The Godfather today, ending as it does, where the Corleone power has been amassed and solidified, and Kay has this woeful face and a door that's closing out and shutting her out of the room? And I simply proposed this. I said that suppose Kay is a reasonably educated, sane, conscientious woman, and suppose she realizes, as she says in Godfather Part Two, Michael, this must end. And suppose she says, I'm the person who should end it. I have to become a witness against my husband and against a big part of my family. That's something women have to do these days, I think. And I think that a Godfather film that did that, too late now, but I think that could have been a fascinating film.
Yeah.
Better than Godfather Part 3.
That's maybe not a very controversial opinion.
Right.
It's interesting. I mean, you're talking about screen actors, of course, and you can't talk about that character, those characters in that film, without thinking about how important Al Pacino has been in screen acting history, and that's interesting.
But I mean, you're so right what you're saying about that, but I don't think Fred Roos is nearly widely enough credited. Fred Roos, for decades, was Francis's casting director, and one of the great casting directors. If you look at a Coppola film, you go down the cast, there's not a flaw in it. Everyone is just superb. And Fred Roos has a credit, but it doesn't have the reputation. Was vital to that approach to the actors.
That's interesting too, to think about the relationship between actors and other people in the production of films. I mean, we tend to think, when talking about directors, we sometimes think about actor-director combinations, and that there's certain pairings that you see recurrent throughout history. Are there any that you think of that are noteworthy? I mean, you can think of De Niro and Scorsese for the sort of easiest example.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the way Cary Grant was a focus for Hawks and Hitchcock, for other directors, but particularly those two people, it goes on all the time. When directors find actors they love, it's usually because that actor has something they wish they had in person, I think. And there can be fascinating interactions. I mean, von Sternberg and Dietrich, very obviously. There was a rapport, but a kind of toxic rapport between them that is, it's really why Sternberg made some great films. If he had never met Marlene Dietrich, I'm not sure he'd be known now. I think that she was abrasive and seductive to him in ways that were vital to his development as an artist.
Is that something that you think is going to have the same importance in the coming years with regard to filmmaking?
I don't know. I mean, it touches on the thing I said earlier about male gaze, female gaze, or something beyond both of them. I mean, ideally, we ought to have a gaze that is our gaze. It's a sort of total American social gaze rather than a gender-directed gaze. A lot of people got into the movies. A lot of directors got into the movies to fuck women. It sounds blunt and crude. It was true. It is still true. Although the climate has changed a great deal, it is still true. And a lot of people go to movies to dream of having sex with strangers.
What's the best follow-up question to something like that? It's an interesting thing to think about. I mean, yeah, I think that the glamour of the movies is so powerful, and just the charisma of stars, what we call star quality, is something that everyone is susceptible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, to be very plain and blunt about it, Donald Trump is a movie star. People love him, although they know that love is irrational and impossible and absurd and dangerous. But it has to do with why a huge number of Americans will follow him wherever he asks them to go. It's a totally irrational, passionate thing. And how do they know it? Because they've seen him on their screens. And he is a master. Nobody handles the screen today better than he does.
It's an eerie thing to think about. You do say in the book that the subject is, in general terms, you describe it as being about the assumption of authority. And there's a quote here. Where is it? Oh, yeah, you say, or is it the transaction of seeing and being seen that is in charge? The idea that there's a transactional nature of film, and that itself has a kind of authoritative aspect. I'm curious about how, I don't know, how our relationship with authority continues going forward with regard to movies.
Well, you're a filmmaker. Let me ask you this. Do you feel you make stories or statements, or do you think you make films about seeing and being seen as a transaction?
Well, I mean, the transactional aspect of it is very top of mind, as they say, because of course you have to figure out, how do we pay for this? How do we get people to see it so that we can afford it? And how do we make the next one? And you need to make a case. You need to find your perch in a very crowded world.
Right.
But when conceiving the things, for me personally, it's the idea of being seen is very much the only thing. The idea that the characters give voice to a kind of yearning to be seen.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is sort of a combination of autobiography and to some extent violating the privacy of other people who you think, that would be a good character.
Totally agree. Yeah.
And then you try to sell it to strangers. It's a really weird thing.
Other people's money. One of the big elements in this book.
That's right.
Other people's money and what your responsibility to the money is.
Yeah. And I think, questions about authority really do sort of go back to questions about responsibility and how we treat each other and ourselves. There's a lot to unpack. I see that we're up at the top of the hour here, and I just want to look through, and I feel like we may be about ready to wrap it up. Here's a question from someone that I think we have time for. David, what are the books and who are the writers that you return to? That's a great question. Who are the writers that you return to and why? Tell us why as well.
Nabokov.
Hmm.
All the writers I return to are because of the prose.
Hmm.
I mean, that sounds silly and it sounds sort of formal, but I return to Nabokov, I return to Didion, I return to Dickens for the way prose is handled. The reason I write is because I love playing with words.
Mm.
And that sounds very artificial and sort of distant from the real world. I don't think it is, but I know I wouldn't do it if I didn't delight in questions like, should that word go before that word or afterwards? That kind of thing. And I love writers who I feel have the same sort of obsessive interest in language.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that that is clear in your prose. It's one of the reasons that I've been reading you for many years. And the state of film commentary is another thing that we could talk about on another occasion, perhaps. But yeah, your work shines for that reason, I think. It also reminds me, you have a bit of a wisecrack in there about how you maybe would prefer to read Jeff Dyer's book about Tarkovsky's film than actually, as opposed to actually watching Tarkovsky's Stalker.
Yeah.
Which is a fair point. That's, I think, Dyer is a great stylist as well, and
he really is.
Yeah,
it's a bit of a tease to him too, because we are close friends.
I'm told that we have time for, it looks like, one more question if anybody wants to type one in there, and otherwise maybe I can make something up. And in the meantime, while waiting for that, I'll just say thanks again to you and to City Lights and to Zoetrope for making this happen.
I want to say thank you too. I've been a little unkind to Zoetrope, so I apologize for that. But I want to be clear, very grateful to you for doing this, and I appreciate your position and your work, and I look forward to seeing it, more of it.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Here's something in the comments. Someone says, you're a great associative thinker. How do you balance the connections you make with the forward drive of your arguments? And I'm just sort of quoting that as it is. I'm not sure if
I think it's a very flattering question.
Yeah.
And I haven't the faintest idea what the answer to it is. I don't know. I think it's to do with getting up and doing something that will stop me being upset about being awake and alive,
That's a good answer. I mean, I agree. I think that, the associations that go back and forth, in the book, in a lot of your are always very thrilling. And, sometimes the experience of reading about films is, as we are suggesting, even more pleasurable or richer, or longer lasting than watching the movies themselves.
It can be.
Well, I see Peter again, so I think that means that we're going to wrap it up. But
our time has come. Gentlemen, thank you both. This was such a delight. It really has been such an honor to have you both with us.
Thank you to everyone who's been involved with this thing this evening. A lot of fun. I enjoyed it very much.
Likewise. Thank you. Thanks, David. Thank you, Peter. And thanks, everyone else. Be well. Good evening.